Hello, everyone. This is Krista Martel. I am the Executive Director of the Well Project, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our third in our series of webinars this year for our 2017 Watch series. And this webinar is entitled Why Language Matters, Facing HIV Stigma in Our Own Words. So we are extremely excited about this topic. It's been something that we've been, wanting to do more work on with the Well Project and for many years, and so we're excited that we're here today. And as you can see, there's an attendee chat. We welcome people to enter in hellos, tell you where you're from, or tell everyone where you're from, and just say hi to the other attendees.
Oh, I can't hear them.
Today we have an amazing group of speakers and panelists. We have Vickie Lynn, who is a community advisory board member. She's also been a blogger with A Girl Like Me. Just a reminder to our speakers, if you have your phone or computer on mute while you're not speaking. I hear a little background noise, with the Well Project, and she is also a doctoral candidate with the University of South Florida, and just had a great day yesterday with her dissertation proposal. We also have Olivia Ford, who is a consulting editor with the Well Project, among many other things, and she'll talk a little bit more about that when she's speaking. Again, my name is Krista Martel. I'm the Executive Director for the Well Project, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. And then we have this great lineup of panelists who will be speaking to their experiences around language and stigma and their advocacy within that, including Tiommi Jenae Luckett, who is part of the Well Project, and as well as she works with PWN and the U.S. PLHIV Caucus. We also have Venita Ray, who works with the Legacy Community Health Organization and is also a board member for PWN. And we have Yamini, and she is with HIVE and PLEASEPrepme.org, and Caroline, who is also with HIVE. And so we look forward to having them give more of an introduction when they speak in a little bit. And just wanted to let you know who all is going to be on today's webinar. Okay, so for those who are new to the Well Project, we are a nonprofit organization with a mission to change the course of the HIV/AIDS pandemic through a unique and comprehensive focus on women and girls. And we do that mostly by leveraging technology through our online resources, specifically at thewellproject.org, to improve the health outcomes and increase quality of life for women and girls living with HIV. We have both a national and global reach, and we do most of our work by providing accessible and comprehensive information, community support, and advocacy building. So now I'm going to hand it over to Caroline, who, as we mentioned, HIVE and PWN and PLEASEPrepme.org are all partners for this webinar. So Caroline's going to give you a little bit more background information about HIVE.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Watson, and I'm the Social Justice and Communications Coordinator at HIVE, which is a hub of positive reproductive and sexual health. Our mission is advancing reproductive and sexual wellness for individuals, families, and communities affected by HIV in San Francisco and beyond. And our vision is a world where people affected by HIV have safe pregnancies, reproductive autonomy, access to state-of-the-art health care, and enjoyable sex lives. Some programs of HIVE include positive outcomes for women engaged in reproductive health, or Power Health, positive reproductive outcomes for men living with HIV, or Pro-Men. We have the HIVE Clinic, which serves women living with HIV and women who have partners who are living with HIV, who are pregnant or would like to become pregnant. We have Hangouts with HIVE, which are webinars on a variety of topics presented via Google Hangouts on Air by the amazing Yamini. The HIVE blog is blogs written by patients, consumers, and providers. We have tools for providers and patients. We Are All Women is an advocacy movement and our practice of including trans women in cis women's healthcare. We have the Language Matters campaign, which is in collaboration with many people, including the wonderful Vickie Lynn, and you'll hear more about it shortly. And Please Prep Me, which brings me to Yamini.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Caroline, for setting the stage. My name is Yamini, and I work with both HIVE and Please Prep Me. And I'm really honored to be here, and I want to share real quick who we are as pleaseprepme.org. We are a website that is has 4 components. Pleaseprepme.org directory is a California-specific PrEP providers directory, and in collaboration with preplocator.org, we actually are able to provide listings throughout the nation. We also have a component of Please Prep Me state resources, where we have built out for all 50 states resource pages for local HIV prevention options in both English and Spanish. There's also Please Prep Me Connect, which is an awesome tool that we've been able to embed into our website, which is a live chat feature and is a very inviting sort of space to learn and ask questions. And the 4th component is Please Prep Me Global, which is over the last few months we've been able to really expand and collaborate with global partners to get a sense of what's going on in PrEP specifically around the world, and share and give props to those who are doing PrEP work. And if I could have the next slide. Thank you. I just wanted to quickly share some of our materials. We have a ton, and we'll get more into this when I give a short talk in a few minutes, but I wanted to share some of the materials that we've created over the years. And the language that we use is going to be part of the topic of my presentation, so I wanted to share this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline and Yamini. We're really excited to have you be on this panel and talk about the work that you're doing through HIVE and Please Prep Me, as well as hear more about the amazing resources that you have. Okay, oops, I'm just forwarding. Okay, and I'm going to hand it over to Tiommi to give a brief overview about PWN.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tiommi Luckett, and I am the Communications Assistant with PWN, as well as the Block Project Coordinator with Positive Women's Network USA and the US PLHIV Caucus. Okay. And about the Positive Women's Network, it was actually founded in 2008 by 28 diverse women living with HIV, and that does mean that at its inception, trans women were included in the founding of Positive Women's Network USA. I myself am a trans woman. I sit on the staff, and we also have trans women as a part of our board. Today, we have 3,000 members nationwide, 7 formally affiliated regional chapters. They have started moving from the regional chapter to the state chapter now, so we no longer have like PWN Philly, but PWN Pennsylvania, right? And Texas actually has PWN Texas, but they also have the greater Houston area as well as Dallas-Fort Worth. So we still do work within regions, but we have moved to a state model, right, of advocacy. Positive Women's Network USA is the only national organization in the U.S. led by and for living with HIV. Our mission is to prepare and involve women living with HIV in all of our diversity, including gender identity and sexual expression in all levels of policy and decision making. We envision a world where women living with HIV can live long, healthy, dignified, and productive lives free from stigma and discrimination.
Great. Thank you so much, Tiommi. And so hopefully most of the people on today's webinar are aware of all these great organizations. We've partnered with them for years and love their work, and so we encourage you to get more familiar with them if you're not already. So just a couple notes about WATCH. WATCH stands for Women's Advocacy and Treatment Coalition on HIV, and it's an ongoing HIV treatment advocacy and capacity building webinar series that was started in 2015. And so this year's series will be taking place throughout the year and includes 3 to 4 webinars. We are planning to produce another webinar on this topic that's more targeted to providers, and we'll be hopefully having more information about that in the coming week or so. And we look forward to hopefully having it take place in early to mid-December. So this year we'll be issuing certificates for each of the webinars for those who attended either the full live webinar or viewed the recording and took both the pre and the post test. And my apologies that some of the certificates have not gone out yet for previous webinars, but they will be going out soon. So we apologize in advance for that. Okay, and just a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be taking place until 1:30, so it's approximately 90 minutes, and we will be having a Q&A session at the end. We encourage you to put in any questions you have during the webinar itself, and we'll be collecting those and posing those both to our speakers and our panelists at the end of the webinar. Everyone is muted except for the speakers right now, and we typically keep it that way so to reduce noise, but if for some reason someone wants to speak up, we can work on unmuting towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so quickly today, here's our agenda. The title is Facing HIV Stigma in Our Own Words, and we're going to go through an introduction as to why language does matter. We'll be talking about HIV stigma communication and preferred language. We'll also be talking about empowering women through language and how you can use language in your advocacy, either for yourself alone or further along with the community or even with wider networks. We will also have our panel discussion and then Q&A. So here is where I'm going to hand it over to Vickie Lynn, and who has been kind of a pioneer of this topic for years now, and we're really excited to have her talk more to this.
Krista, can everybody hear me? We good?
Yes. Yes, great.
Okay, great. I am really excited to be talking with all of you today, and a special shout out to the WELL Project and everyone for putting this together, and I know a lot of hard work goes behind putting something like this together. My name is Vickie Lynn, and I know many of you on the webinar, so that's pretty exciting. For those of you who don't know, I'm on the advisory panel for the WELL Project, a Girl Like Me blogger, and I've also been living with HIV for 32 years. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of South Florida, and just yesterday successfully defended my dissertation proposal, which is a huge step. And real quick, I just really want to encourage each of you to follow your dreams no matter what they are. If you want to go to school, start a business, take baby steps, and before you know it, you'll be taking giant leaps. You deserve it. With that said, let's get started on why we're here today, so why language matters.
Okay, so
talk about.
Oh, sorry, Vickie. We have a poll question really quickly. I apologize to interrupt you. So I'm just going to quickly run this poll, and there's no right or wrong answer on this. This is just to kind of help the speakers learn a little bit more about your experience with this. So the poll question is, have you ever encountered words that hurt, also known as stigmatizing language, about HIV from families and friends, or family members, friends, or colleagues? I'm going to just show everyone can see right now we have about 93% are saying yes, 7% or so are saying no, so that's a large number of people. We will close the poll in just about 10 more seconds. Okay, so close to 95%, well, about 95% have encountered stigmatizing language. All right, we're going to close the poll now, and I'll hand it back to you, Vickie. Sorry.
Okay, great. No, that's fine. And the poll clearly shows that in our day-to-day life, we do hear stigmatizing language, whether that be about our HIV or either some other aspect of our life. The words we use to talk about ourselves and others is powerful and can change how we feel about ourselves and how we perceive others. Have you ever heard a person living with HIV describe themselves as, I am HIV? For some, I know this might be empowering, but we never hear someone say, I am cancer or I am diabetes. We also, when I hear someone use the word infection or refer to a person as infected, it actually drives me crazy. I think because I've been referred to as infected for the past 32 years. I've heard it repeatedly over the past few decades, and it starts to wear on your soul. I am not my illness. I'm so much more than that, and HIV is just something I must live with. I once heard someone say it was the roommate that they had to tolerate, but it doesn't define who we are. Words have power over and help shape our understanding of the world we live in. They define our experiences and are the foundation of our story. Words and language describe who we are and how we connect with the world around us. Most of us have had one of those days when everything is going great and someone says a single word that changes everything. That word does something to us deep inside. We feel it in our gut, in our heart, and in our soul. In a heartbeat, that one word either builds us up or tears us down. Words can inspire, they can empower us, and they can bring hope, but they can also bully people and scare and destroy our sense of self. As women, we experience multiple forms of oppression and discrimination based on our gender, our race, our sexual identity, socioeconomic status, and even other factors. And the words and language used to describe us reinforces that oppression. For instance, an aggressive, powerful woman is sometimes called a bitch, while a man who might have those same qualities is viewed with respect and called ambitious. And when we add an HIV diagnosis on who we are as women and people, that can magnify the oppression that we feel. And it affects how our self-worth, our confidence, and our self-identity. Over the years, repeatedly hearing language that reinforces stigma, oppression, and discrimination ultimately affects our health and well-being. Stigma and stress have a negative effect on our quality of life. This affects our family, our children, our jobs, and even our pregnancy. It's actually rare to find a woman living with HIV who has not felt stigmatized in some way.
Okay,
and I guess we have a poll question.
Yep, we have another poll question. So this poll question is, have you ever encountered words that hurt, also known as stigmatizing language, about HIV in a healthcare setting? Okay, I'll keep it open for just another 20 seconds or so. But the majority, over 80%, have experienced stigmatizing language in a healthcare setting, which is definitely what we have heard multiple times and why we're hoping to kind of bring more awareness to this through that other webinar. Okay, I'm going to close up the webinar, or the poll now. Thank you. Yes, we do have a lot of work to do, as Chris says. All right, back to you, Vickie.
Yes, that poll clearly shows that even in with the professionals that we deal with in healthcare settings, we're hearing language that doesn't fit comfortable with us. And I think some of the trainings for professionals have laxed in the past decade or so since the health of people living with HIV has improved. Our education of professionals has suffered a little bit because of that. So why is language, did I skip a slide? Somehow there's a slide missing, but that's okay. Because there's a poll, let me just do that real quick. Sorry, you guys, I just got a little lost on. So certain medical conditions are often stigmatized more than others. Some conditions are seen as moral issues or character flaws instead of the biological diseases that they are. Examples include leprosy, mental health, substance use, and HIV. People with leprosy are often called lepers, and people with mental health conditions are sometimes called the mentally ill. People who use mind-altering substances are called addicts or junkies. Reducing people to labels dismisses their humanity and sets them apart from others. Stigma communication is in the language, labels, and messages used to educate and talk about a disease, condition, or group of people. So the narrative or story about HIV includes myths and false stereotypes that stigmatizes the disease and sometimes isolates us living with HIV. So these stereotypes that people living with HIV are more sexually active than others, and the myth that having sex with a person with HIV automatically means that you'll acquire HIV. The truth is that HIV transmission is virtually impossible when the person with HIV is taking HIV medications and has an undetectable viral load. But stigmatizing stereotypes make for good rumors, gossip, and the news media often uses them to attract attention to their story. Research has shown that emotions more often shared in rumors are fear, anger, or disgust. These rumors then become part of our social environment regardless of whether they are true or not. So the foundation of the story of HIV actually was built and started on these stigmatizing headlines. The early headlines included horrific, frightening stories about people living with HIV. For those of us who have been around a long time, we remember the early days. The days of the epidemic when the media used sensational headlines to report issues about HIV. As women living with HIV at the time, this was difficult because I could not identify with any of these headlines. My story wasn't in these headlines, but the narrative of my story and other women's stories has grown from these headlines. So even today, 36 years into this epidemic, we still hear stigmatizing and sensationalized language used by influential people. A Georgia lawmaker recently asked if people with HIV could be legally quarantined. I was so shocked when I heard this. And she even referred to people living with HIV as HIV carriers. The general population outside of the HIV community are ill-informed, and we know that education is desperately needed for everyone at all levels and power in our society. HIV stigma communication is found in the history of HIV. It's in the media, it's in social marketing, prevention campaigns, It's in the policies written, it's in the research literature, it's in movies, and it ends up in our own head. The language we hear, whether it comes from our families, our friends, news headlines, research articles, becomes the language we use to describe ourselves, and then becomes the language we use to describe others, so then we end up repeating the stigmatizing language. Sometimes I hear things slip out of my mouth, and it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just said that. Because even though I'm very passionate about language, sometimes I still say things, but I catch it much sooner than I used to. So when there's actually two types of stigma, internal and external. External stigma comes from what we hear from our families, friends, healthcare providers, and others, what we read in media, in research articles. Internal stigma comes from self-judgment and the negative self-talk we hear in our head. We hear these messages in our own voice and the voices of our loved ones. The language used in these messages is developed by our own experiences in life with stigma, discrimination, with shame, and guilt. Poll question.
Hi there. Okay. We'll do another poll question here. Just a reminder to our presenters, if you can make sure your phone or your computer's on mute because we do have some background noise. We want to just try and keep, and we're seeing these comments that some people cannot see the slides, and we apologize for that. I'll be posting a link shortly to the slides that go along with the fact sheet on this topic. They're not exactly the same slides as the webinar, but there's many of the slides are the same, so that can at least maybe help people. So, okay, so the next poll question is, do you feel like words that hurt or stigmatizing words have affected how you think about yourself and about living with HIV? And as this poll is running, I'll just let everyone know that there will be a recording available of the presentation with the audio and the slides as they're being presented today. So we apologize that people are having trouble. I don't know why that would be, but we will certainly look into it. Okay, so again, high numbers. More than 2/3 of people feel that stigmatizing words have affected their own thinking about themselves and living with HIV. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now and hand it back to Vickie.
Thank you. It's amazing that even yesterday I was so nervous doing my dissertation proposal, and I have so much proof in my life that I'm successful and I've done well. 30 years ago I was homeless living under a bridge, and I just successfully defended my dissertation proposal, but there's this little voice in my head that continually tells me I'm not good enough. And it's from that negative self-talk that for some of us, not all of us, that we continue to tell ourselves, and it's trying to turn that voice off and replace it with really powerful messages. So the more awareness we bring to the importance of language, the more change we see. One of the first places to start is that language we hear in our own head, the things we tell ourselves daily that define who we are within ourselves. Sometimes it's the story we tell others that we are not good enough, strong enough, smart enough, or not beautiful enough, that we deserve everything challenging that has happened to us because somehow we're damaged goods. This is called the negative self-talk. And learning to change that is a process. It's definitely not something that happens overnight. It can often take years, and it depends on, how long we've been doing this for ourselves and the awareness we bring to changing that language. One way to do that and change the language is with people first language. The Denver Principles was a document written by HIV advocates in 1983. In the early days of the epidemic, In the opening words, the Denver principles called for the use of respectful, people-first language. We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patient, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS. And I just lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. So in 1983, they wrote that statement, we are people with AIDS. Today, I don't use that term, and I know many people don't use that term. We are actually people with HIV. AIDS, as we know it, is a diagnosis. It's a syndrome. It's not actually the disease. So, and many of us are just living with HIV. We have not progressed to an AIDS diagnosis. So today we are people with HIV. So this narrative describes people living with HIV as human and valuable. It shows respect and compassion. People-first language puts the person before the illness or label and describes who they are, not what they have been diagnosed with. People-first language helps eliminate prejudice and remove value judgment. When we describe people by labels or medical diagnosis, we devalue and disrespect them as individuals. People-first language respects people for who they are. Think about when you hear someone who has a cold or epilepsy. This clearly describes a person with an illness saying, we don't hear people say we saw an epileptic today. But we do hear people say, I saw an HIV-positive person today. That describes the person as the illness rather than a person who happens to have the illness. We never hear cancerous people or I am cancer positive. But like I said, we do hear people say HIV-positive women or HIV-positive pregnant women. We want to move away from saying that and use people-first language as it puts us as people before the diagnosis. And somehow I got my slides mixed up because this is the next slide with the Denver principles. So just to note again, I'll read what the Denver principles wrote about people-first language. We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patient, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with HIV. Now, like I said, it was originally written as people with AIDS, but I think that, we have, even the language within the epidemic has changed since the beginning of the epidemic. And I think it will continue to change. As the epidemic changes, our language will continue to change, and we will become more compassionate with others and value each other as humans. So in the next couple slides, there's charts that show the stigmatizing language and how we shifted to start using the preferred language. So over the years, we've learned more about HIV treatment, care, and prevention, and advocates have pushed for HIV service organizations, media outlets, and other institutions to use language describing HIV that reflects those changes. So, for example, the phrase full-blown AIDS, it actually should never be used, and it actually still is used today. I use it as an example in a lot of my talks that I still read research articles that are published using the phrase full-blown AIDS, but there is no medical definition for full-blown AIDS. So people often laugh when I say there's no such thing as half-blown AIDS. It's simply just AIDS, or today even the CDC has moved to saying stage 3 HIV. So HIV has 3 stages. The initial stage when someone contracts HIV, the second stage, which is where we'd all like to stay, and then the third stage is what we know as an AIDS diagnosis. But we have started to move away from even using this term AIDS. And even AIDS.gov recently changed their name to HIV.gov. So here's some more of the language, the stigmatizing language on the left, the preferred on the right. Oh, I'm sorry, the slide didn't. There it goes. So I know that a big one that we've seen a shift in over the years is mother-to-child transmission has shifted to vertical transmission or perinatal transmission. Mother-to-child transmission seems to carry with it a lot of stigma in relation to blaming the mother. So this is not anything to blame the mother, so changing it to vertical transmission removes that value judgment. And we are definitely not victims, and there is no innocent victim in this. We're all innocent. I mean, that phrase has always driven me crazy. And we're not sufferers. We're not contaminated. We're not infected. We are people living with HIV. We are survivors. We are warriors. It's still interesting that I still hear people say to catch AIDS or to contract AIDS or transmit AIDS. Again, AIDS is not something that can be transmitted. It's a syndrome. It's a diagnosis that someone's given. Another phrase that we hear a lot, especially in the healthcare setting, is compliant. In the patient's chart, you'll read the patient was not compliant. But we're trying to shift even professionals from using that terminology to say adherent. Because we do, when we try to engage in care, compliance just seems like it carries so much authority, like we're supposed to do whatever somebody else tells us to do. And even for sex workers, we've moved away from using terms like prostitute or prostitution. It's sex work. It's sale of sexual services. We've also moved away from referring to HIV as a death sentence. It no longer is. HIV is a chronic and manageable condition, and as long as we're in care and treatment and we take care of ourselves, we can live close to a normal lifespan. And if we're undetectable, we also have no risk of sexually transmitting the virus to others. That is amazing, fantastic news. It's only, the CDC only recently released it, and that information has not been disseminated into the general population, but I know that there's a lot of really great campaigns going on, the U=U campaign, that are trying to change the message that we can no longer have to worry about transmitting virus to others if we're taking care of ourselves and we're undetectable. And I also find it interesting when people say end AIDS or end HIV. It's kind of like they're trying to end me because HIV is part of me, but what we're really trying to say is we want to end HIV transmission or end HIV-related death. And we also want to be specific when we say we're ending AIDS. Do we mean we're ending AIDS, or are we ending the transmission of HIV? Those are pretty distinctive. I think for the general population that hears our messages, it's important that we use terminology that it clearly describes what we're talking about, because people do get confused over the terms AIDS, HIV. They're not as educated as those of us that have been in the HIV community for a long time. So one way to address internalized stigma is to change the messages we say to ourselves. So you can use that chart. If you find yourself using some of the terminology on the left-hand side of the chart, you can start to become aware of that and make mental notes and say, okay, next time I say that, I'm going to replace it with the preferred language. So this helps to change how we see ourselves. And we begin to treat ourselves with more compassion, and then we treat others with more compassion. And one way to do this is through mirror work and self-affirmations and being careful about the words we choose to describe ourselves and the words we use to describe others. Some people, like mirror work is a little weird for some people, but taking a few minutes for yourself to look yourself in the eyes in a mirror and give yourself positive affirmations is so empowering. And I think the first couple times that I was introduced to mirror work, I actually broke down crying because for me, I didn't love myself very much. All these the negative self-talk that I had used over the years had really weighted on my soul. And it was hard for me to tell myself that I loved myself. And it still takes work. I mean, sometimes we all have good and bad days, but looking at yourself in the mirror, deeply into your eyes, your own eyes, and telling yourself that you love you is extremely powerful. So affirmations are messages we tell ourselves. Negative self-talk is a kind of affirmation, but not a very helpful one. So mirror work involves looking in the mirror and saying those positive affirmations to ourselves. Things like, thank you, you're wonderful, you're beautiful, this will pass, but I love you, and this is not forever. Just saying, oh, looking good when you pass by a mirror. These are things to help build you up. You know, we hear enough negative self-talk out there in social media and in the world. It's important that we take care of ourselves and build ourselves up by the words and language we use. And research has found that using positive affirmation and mirror work has helped many women improve their self-image, their confidence, outlook on life, and ultimately their health and well-being. It truly is powerful. So it's important to note that terms and phrases like living with AIDS and I am HIV positive have been extremely empowering to many people living with HIV. While for others, these terms may not describe their experiences or may feel stigmatizing, and that's okay. Words and language mean different things to different people and at different times in our life, and it's important to allow others to define themselves how they wish, but to always start from a place of respect. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Vickie. This is such a great presentation and overview, and we appreciate everything that you've done to really create such awareness to this issue, and we hope that by doing this webinar, others will be doing the same. So we have one last poll question before we're going to start. I'd hand it over to Olivia to talk about kind of how you might utilize this information in your own life or in your advocacy. So the next poll question is, have you ever corrected someone's use of words that hurt, also known as stigmatizing language about HIV? I'll keep this up for just another minute or so. Yes, Venita, that's why you're here. We want to hear more about that.
While the poll is up, everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Just as an intro, Olivia.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll, but this is awesome. That almost 95% have corrected others' use of words. So that's a great place to be starting. Okay, so I'm going to close it up, and Olivia, I take it away. Thank you so much for also being a speaker about this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to get to be part of this conversation and play like just the really small role that I get to play in this really just vital exchange and ongoing conversation around language and stigma. And, you know, as long as the conversation is going on, I'm happy to be part of it. Though, again, as folks have said, we have a lot of work to do. This conversation has been going on for years. Change has happened, and there is still a great deal of change to be made here in the U.S. and across the globe. So I'm coming to this webinar. I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro of myself. I think that a lot of folks on the webinar I know, and we've worked together before. I'm honored to have been able to work with a lot of the folks that I'm here comrades with on the webinar, speakers and panelists. I'm here in this webinar as a consulting editor with the WELL Project, and that's part of about a decade of work in HIV-specific media, sort of witnessing this conversation unfold further. I would say I've been in this for a decade, which is kind of like a baby or a preteen in the sort of greater sort of HIV epidemic and HIV kind of media development. So I haven't been in it for as long as a lot of the folks who are on the webinar, but a little bit of time sort of witnessing the conversation unfold, seeing the language that we use change and evolve. When I was the communications director at Positive Women's Network USA, just doing my best to support the shaping of that conversation with women advocates living with HIV at the helm of it, challenging themselves, others, challenging institutions that they interact with around the language we use. As Vickie has talked about extensively, and our panelists will as well. Again, they're doing fantastic, amazing work and have been for years. And before that, I started out as an editor at thebody.com. And a writer, sort of doing our best to keep up with and model changing language for media outside of our HIV sphere and also within the community. So I come to this from a few different angles. I really want to stress, and this connects with all that Vickie's been saying just really beautifully, that that advocacy, sort of on a larger scale, as we're going to talk about, really begins with ourselves. And I'm going to cheat on one of the later slides and say now, and continue to say over and over, that every time you speak up for yourself, speak up for others, you're being an advocate. So it's really, there are many, many, many different ways to do that work in our lives and sort of out in sort of the public sphere. Hope everyone saw the slide change. The root of advocacy in so many ways is voice and is language, no matter what the topic is. And using our voices and using language to communicate with others to make change, whether that's about language itself and the language we use or other topics. And of course, there are many different levels of advocacy in general, which we talk about at the WELL Project pretty frequently in this way in our work, that advocacy around language is a part of. So there's, of course, and again, sort of highlighting the way that advocacy is about voice. Self-advocacy is really all about speaking up for yourself. It really can begin with that. Individual advocacy for others, including peer advocacy, which is a really, really just key aspect, has been for many years of HIV work and HIV advocacy, speaking up on behalf of someone else, supporting others to speak up for themselves. And there's community advocacy that's getting together with others to speak up about changes that need to be made. And then, of course, political and public advocacy, speaking up to those in power on a national or even an international level. So those are some of we're going to unpack some of those levels of advocacy. So there's self-advocacy, again, every time you speak up for yourself, whether, even in simple things like saying, hey, I'm at the grocery store, I'm getting shortchanged. Anytime you look at something that's happening to you and respond to make a change in your own life, that's advocacy. That's a seed of advocacy right there. And anytime you feel, the kind of sting of that word that hurts, maybe even just from a friend, and say, listen, this is why this is offensive to me, that's advocacy as well. And then, of course, there's kind of more, potential. It can be challenging to speak up to a friend, to be sure, not to say that it's a simple thing, but really, kind of speaking up maybe more on behalf of yourself to institutions, filing a complaint at your job around discrimination, or speaking up to a healthcare provider, which, again, as we've seen from the poll numbers, is a really important need in the community, which is not to say that everyone is in a position to do that or everyone should be speaking to their healthcare providers. It's really important to approach advocacy, each person at their own pace, because it's challenging to raise our voices in this way. That's why it's good to be connected with other people who may be working from different levels of advocacy, who can support your voice or even be that voice if needed. But even, asking a healthcare provider not to use the term HIV infected again, which Vickie discussed so eloquently and just so passionately, and I know that folks were talking in the chat box about identifying with that. Just starting there, I mean, it's a term that's really rampantly used. We're just starting to see medical institutions, healthcare providers start to recognize the impact of this term. So that kind of self-advocacy is advocacy as well, of course. So now individual advocacy for others, including peer advocacy, as we talked about earlier. So that's really, and this can also include, this is come up in the chat box as well, and in Vickie's presentation about preferred language. That can include challenging and changing language around vulnerable communities, communities affected by HIV, communities that are overlapping and intersectional with the HIV community. That includes, all women. And again, to use the example of sex work, there's a lot of stigmatizing language around sex work. There's a lot which impacts the way that sex workers are viewed as transmitting HIV, as vectors of disease. When that goes, again, as we'll talk about a little bit later in these slides, really goes against it first of all is hurtful on an individual level, is damaging on the level of the community that's being stigmatized, and also goes against the information and knowledge that we have about community and about HIV transmission. So we've got our science on our side in a lot of ways. So individual advocacy, that's supporting someone who needs help, trying to find a solution when someone has a problem, or supporting another person living with HIV around an HIV-related issue. Again, peer advocacy, I'm sure everyone has heard of, if not has been involved in, just a really core aspect of HIV work. And again, that can be anywhere from writing a letter to a news outlet in terms of the language piece, to helping a friend think through what she wants to say to her provider about a stigmatizing term that they use. So again, if someone says, I don't really know how to do this, going to a friend, a peer who can support, who can help, who can share experiences that they may have had. Engaging in similar self-advocacy to support that person. So that support is that peer advocacy and is individual advocacy for other folks. So now, community advocacy, we get into that change-making on a scale beyond the individual. And again, individual advocacy can feed that community advocacy, but it's really when we witness or experience a collection of kind of individual problems, folks having issues that are tied to that are similar, that are or that mirror one another, and that are tied to the actions of an institution, or tied to an entrenched set of ideas in the community, that we can then pressure to make that change on a larger scale. So it's not just stop using this term when you speak to this client, healthcare provider. Hey, clinic, you need to change your language across the board. It's not just about advocating for this individual person, but for everyone else who comes through the doors going forward. And again, before getting involved in any kind of more public and community advocacy, it's important to think about how comfortable you are as far as that disclosing your HIV status. It's a personal decision. It requires thought, discussion. I always say, as someone who's worked quite a lot in HIV-specific online media, the internet is forever. Anything that one puts out next to their name is Googleable. A lot of people are fine with that, but it's really important that folks be able to make informed decisions about getting involved in advocacy. That's just one example. But there are so many ways to be involved in advocacy whether or not you decide to disclose. Whether you decide to be public or private with your status, you can still engage in community advocacy. Absolutely. You can be involved with local HIV awareness campaigns, fundraising events, AIDS walks, of course. You can join a patient advisory group at a research site, at an HIV service organization, join your local planning council. And, of course, I've called out a couple of campaigns that are language specific and have a social media component. Again, whether or not you choose to disclose, and the Well Project has wonderful resources on using social media and the disclosure issues around that, ways to be at all levels of the disclosure spectrum while using social media. You can get involved in supporting and spreading the word around campaigns on social media if you decide you're comfortable doing that. The campaigns that I've mentioned here, Language Matters, Not Your Infection, which I'm not going to go into because some of our panelists are going to touch even more on those. We Are All Clean are examples where people living with HIV and allies, accomplices, sort of all came together to express their concerns on issues around language and representation of people living with HIV or affected by HIV. Just to describe We Are All Clean as an example, that was a campaign a couple of years ago to combat kind of online language in chat rooms and on dating sites where people would ask people's HIV status by asking, quote unquote, "Are you clean?" This is something that still goes on. I say did, but it's still definitely a common practice. So the campaign had people taking, I don't know if folks remember it, it had people taking selfies in the shower saying we're, people living with HIV, people who are not living with HIV, saying we're all clean. It's not appropriate to talk about people, individuals, and their health status as being clean or not clean, which, again, Vickie touched on in her presentation around preferred language. So these are different ways to be involved. And, again, that's you can disclose, you can not disclose, and still be involved. Switching slides. Hopefully everyone sees them moving. So, some of these campaigns around language have grown in power, reached the ears of federal officials, and changed the actions of federal agencies. Advocates have been responsible for, exposing the extent to which the language that's used by these institutions, again, becomes the language that gets used in healthcare environments, becomes the language that people use among themselves and in their own heads. These institutions that are so aligned with the halls of science, cutting-edge research, could in many cases, their language itself be guided by stigma and by fear, rather than the sound scientific information that we have access to and the voices of the community that are very, very strong in responding to what these institutions do. So there's ample ways to find out what the impact of this language are. So, it's come up several times on the webinar already. U equals U is a great example, tireless, rigorous advocacy by Bruce Richmond, the kind of leader of that campaign, and many, many others. I know he'd be the first to say, this is absolutely a team effort without a doubt. It could not happen without the actions of many to uplift the message that undetectable equals untransmittable, and how essential this is to the lives of people living with HIV and to people who are not living with HIV for prevention, to eliminate stigma, to be clear on this point, to the way where now CDC recently has now changed its risk language. To quickly quote, people who take antiretroviral therapy daily as prescribed and achieve and maintain an undetectable viral load have effectively no risk of sexually transmitting the virus to an HIV-negative partner. That took years to get CDC to say that. And that's part of, a kind of history of, I'm not putting CDC on the chopping block, but an example of people pointing out to CDC where the language needs to match the information that we have available of HIV and risk. Even just this past June, HIVE, who we've got on the webinar as partners, responded with other allies in the community to some really misguided guidance around fear in different couples and conception that was really rooted in stigma and fear. By August, CDC had made really, really powerful changes. A couple years ago, CDC went from using unprotected sex language to using sex without condoms. Because oftentimes we use unprotected sex, as, again, Vickie said, as a blanket statement to say when we really mean sex without condoms. But oftentimes sex without condoms is not unprotected because of treatment as prevention, because of PrEP. It's a quote, and it was the HIV Prevention Justice Alliance that led that effort back in 2013, 2014, I believe. Unprotected is used to refer to the non-use of condoms. I'm quoting here. However, it does not mean that sex occurred in an environment of heightened HIV risk. That's really powerful for a federal institution to recognize and reflect through their language. And quickly, and of course, AIDS.gov recently became HIV.gov. Which Vickie already covered. That was a huge win. I just want to add that these, I can't stress enough, these aren't just niceties of language, which has hopefully been clear throughout this whole webinar. I'm going to quote HIV Prevention Justice Alliance again in their letter to CDC from 2014. I think it really sums it up. These distinctions are neither political nor semantic. It's not just about the language. They're integral to reaching the goals of the National HIV Strategy and to curtailing the epidemic. End quote. They're vital to the lives of people living with HIV, people affected by HIV. Language is important. Language matters, as we say. So, for many women living with HIV, starting to think about and make changes to the language that they use around HIV has been a profoundly empowering experience. Folks have expressed that in the chat box and on the webinar already. I think that Speak Up 2014, the presentation that Vickie and Valerie gave has been mentioned. That was such a powerful turning point in the lives of so many women living with HIV. I was honored to be a part of that Speak Up. For some, it's led to pointing out stigmatizing language used by others, family, friends, providers, reaching out to media, whether on social media or through letters to the editor when inappropriate language is used in media, to call it out and let folks know that they're actually not sharing accurate information when they share stigmatizing language. And then so that can lead to folks joining campaigns to work on language issues, which we're going to hear more about in just a minute. HIV advocates have won, as we've talked about, changes to this language by large institutions. It can be done. We've seen examples, and even more. This was just a slice of that. But again, there are so many powerful ways to be an advocate, and they don't all involve being the loudest voice in the crowd or a loud voice in a big crowd. It really starts with ourselves. Anytime you even question a phrase that you've come to use, it's become common knowledge that fuels stigma and ignorance. You're contributing to building hope. You're contributing to ending HIV stigma. And that's part of changing our entire culture from one that disrespects women living with HIV to one that uses language to support the power and support the dignity of all women. So really those individual efforts are feeding that ultimate goal. So on that note, I'm gonna say thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to our phenomenal panel led by Vickie and Krista.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Olivia. I think this is such an important piece for people to understand how, to take this information and, use it within their own, inner spectrum and then, beyond that and all the different levels and ways that it can really make an impact to, having huge institutions kind of change their language. So I appreciate all that information. And so now I will hand it over. I would like each of our panelists to just give a brief introduction of themselves and, maybe a little bit about how you, came to, whether it be in a personal aspect or at a conference, or how you kind of became, or through work, involved in this, in this area and begin kind of like your advocacy within that. So we'll just go in the order that it's listed on the slide, with Tiommi first.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you both, Vickie Lynn and Olivia. Great presentation. My name is Tiommi Jenae Luckett. I am the communications coordinator here with the Well Project. I'm also a blogger with A Girl Like Me. I also sit on the community advisory board for the Well Project and consulted in a bunch of different other areas, especially when it concerns the transgender fact sheets. So I was very instrumental in that. To answer your question, Krista, it was actually at a conference, and it was actually in a session that was led by Vickie Lynn as well as Valerie, and I know I will mess up the last name, so I'm not going to attempt it. And they were speaking on, destigmatizing language, and it was the very first time that I had ever thought about how we speak about ourselves. And so, because I was very new to advocacy, and it just so happened that in that very first year of me getting into the field of HIV work, that I met all of the heavy hitters, and Vickie was one of them. So, she and I and Olivia and Tammy Hart, we worked on a media guide for journalists when reporting on people living with HIV, because we're just that. We're people first and not our condition. And so, yeah, that's how I got started. And you know me, once I get my sights on something, I don't stop. So here I am.
That's true.
Thank you. And that's why we love Tiommi. She does not let anything stop her or stand in her way, which is great. So, and Venita, would you like to give a little background of who you are and kind of your background and introduction into this area?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Venita Ray. I live here in Houston. I happen to work for Legacy Community Health, which is a huge, federally qualified health center, health clinic. I also consider called a public policy manager. I do a lot of work on the ground building leadership and advocacy in the voices of people living with HIV, as well as being involved in a number of national and local issues related to HIV, like criminalization and clearly stigmatizing language. I also happen to be a board member with Positive Women's Network, and so really thrilled with that. So having only got in this since maybe 2014, my first exposure to this was a webinar that Vickie, Valerie, and Olivia moderated for PWN. Must have been that same year. I wasn't at the actual, I was at the summit, but I didn't go to it. And then I heard that, and one of my friends here was mentioning to me, and at first it just said, okay, stigmatizing language, I'm trying to get a sense of advocacy. It didn't hit me at first, and it might have taken a year before I went, whoa, that is important, because I thought, well, we got so many other issues. Why is the language one? And when I looked around, we've been trying to reduce stigma for however many years, and we've never touched language. And just the fact that you guys had sensitized me to it, I think with my friend Marinake here and on that webinar, I began to notice or become very sensitive to the use of the terms infected and things like this. And something hit me a year later that said, this is important, and I am getting ready to champion this. And I was involved in that 5 ways to stop media makers, from with all y'all, Tiommi and Tammy and all those, because then it really started hitting me when I started reading articles and things, like especially around criminalization, how negatively we were portrayed, and the language was horrendous. And so it began a movement, and yeah, we're here now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Venita. So, Vickie, I hope you're feeling pretty powerful around this movement that you've started through your work on this over the years. I remember her kind of talking about this back in 2012 and writing kind of a blog a little bit that touched upon this back then. So it's amazing to see kind of the growth. And so, Yamini, I'll ask you to go next.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, as has been mentioned before, I can't say how honored I am to be co-presenting on this webinar. I almost feel like I don't deserve to be here. But on the other hand, I want to share that, for me coming into this work, I think I really want to acknowledge I've been working in HIV essentially for 10 plus years, and majority of that sort of working on the treatment side of things as peer advocate, treatment advocate, case manager, et cetera, and then kind of stepping into a role around prevention and really biomedical prevention, PrEP, and all these topics, and just really thinking about what bridges one to the other. And how does this work come full circle for me? And really acknowledging that so much of what I know personally, as well as I think what we try to embody organizationally and implement, is really rooted in what we have learned from HIV treatment advocates, and as well as patients, as well as families, as well as loved ones. And also just going back to what Vickie Lynn was sharing earlier about the Denver principles, for example, back in 1983, these conversations were being had. And so much of our efforts towards destigmatizing language and sort of inclusivity comes from those decades of lived experience. So I'm just really thankful to be able to channel all of those learnings into a forward direction. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Yamini. And Caroline, would love to have you go next.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So HIVE has a long history of addressing and changing stigmatizing language, such as the change from serodiscordant to serodifferent and mother-to-child transmission to perinatal transmission. And this history created the space and the interest for me to find a home for the Language Matters campaign. I'm not living with HIV, and my husband is. And I saw and immediately loved the PWN anti-stigma media campaign and shared it several times on social media. And in 2014, I was touched by the Not Your Infection campaign, which was started by Mina and her mom, Morinike. Mina was 12 at the time, and she and her mom started the campaign to stop health professionals from using the word infected when referring to people living with HIV. And a quote from Mina that I wanted to share was, "Not your infection is important to me because people living with HIV deserve respect. A word can be correct, but that doesn't make it nice. I am living with HIV, not an HIV-infected person. I am not an infection." And I also want to say how much I'm honored to be on this webinar with these amazing women. And thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And as we've said, too, we're super honored to have you all here. And so we're going to have a couple questions that we're going to just put out, and, if it speaks to you and you want to answer, and we'll move on. If there's questions from the audience also that you would like to know or talk to or ask of the panelists or the speakers, please put those in the chat as well. So the first question is, can you share, because Olivia addressed this a little bit, that sometimes it's not easy, correcting someone else, especially if it's a provider or someone, that you maybe don't have a super close relationship with. And can you share a story about how you address the use of stigmatizing language with, either a provider or a friend or a family member or even in the media? And, were you successful? So anyone want to jump in and talk about that?
I will. It's Caroline.
Okay, great.
So Mina's campaign felt extremely powerful to me, and I wanted to do something to support it through HIVE. So I contacted Morinike, and we reached out to Vickie Lynn, Valerie Wojciechowicz, I learned how to say her name, Venita Ray, and Brandon Gallagher. Together, we created the Language Matters letter, which specifies the practice of asking people what their pronouns are, how they identify with regards to gender and sexuality, and also lays out why people first language is appropriate and respectful, and includes Vickie's wonderful table of terms with additions from the other collaborators. Vickie, Gina Brown, and I passed out the letter at a CDC stakeholders meeting where we saw some uptake. And the letter has been signed by 68 individuals and organizations, including the Florida Department of Public Health, from around the country who pledged to use preferred language and update their materials where possible.
Wow. Very cool. So this is Venita. Caroline, I'm sorry. Are you finished? That's really cool.
Yep. Sounds like it. Go ahead, Venita. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, and I totally, Caroline, thanks for reminding me about that. It was really awesome working on that language and the Language Matters and sign on. And so for me, some of the I've been able to I remember being able to do a few things from being in an advocacy class when someone asked, and I'm a woman living with HIV, why do they think Black women are more impacted by HIV, and I wasn't through my process of acceptance of my status, and someone said, because they're more promiscuous, and I remember my face turned red. I had to get up and walk out So to go from there in maybe 2009 to now, you know, looking, even in the Ryan-White Planning Council, and I started to become conscious of the terms that were used. And just recently, they've agreed to, now they're going through all the documents after a couple years push and changing all of our documents to non-stigmatizing language, to Bristol Myers Squibb reading one of their brochures on viral suppression about a year and a half ago, and the language was very, to me, stigmatizing based on what I had learned, and telling them that, and they said, oh, well, we've got so many of these produced that we don't know, and thank God Shabar Perryman, who is worked with them, took it back to them, and they agreed to rewrite their brochures and change the language and all of their handouts from that point on. That's when I went, shit, people, you know, we need to listen to this, to going to a process where I am leading an Ending the Epidemic campaign here in the city of Houston, and my end plan that was released last year does not use one stigmatizing word. So we were able to produce a whole document where we don't use the words calling people by their disease, as well as one of our recommendations for ending the epidemic was eliminating the use of stigmatizing language. So it is now action and a recommendation in our ending the epidemic plan. And then lastly, I'll say I got a little grant to engage positive people, and they've called themselves the POS Strike Force. Here's some of my young up-and-coming advocates, and they're developed the presentation from yours, Vickie, and they're going around and presenting eliminating the use of stigmatizing language to our Ryan-White Planning Council, other groups, any group we can get in front, and they are actually presenting this kind of message to them, so they're being empowered to stand in front of them as positive people and say, these words hurt, and you need to change the way you speak. So a lot of stuff is coming up because of what y'all did. So thank you.
Awesome. So I can share real quick about please prep me and what we've learned just in creating PrEP, biomedical prevention sort of materials, and dealing with constraints around that. And so I'll start by saying one of the ways that we have, and one of the ways that's central to how we combat stigma in our work, and it also happens to be central to this webinar, is to really shift our language use to inclusivity. And so while, you know, CDC guidelines are very important and appreciated, just like Olivia was mentioning earlier, we have felt like we must take that a step further. And so, you know, we think about things like how can we create materials that invite folks in rather than keep folks out? How can we create a partnership with the person who is reading our palm card, for example, or visiting our website? How can we support their journey towards sexual health? And, you know, one of the ways that we've done this, is one of the tangible ways that we've actually been able to do this, is by putting language, like, for example, on our palm cards, like PrEP is for all genders, even though there's a list of guidelines that we have inherited that say PrEP is for you if you do this, PrEP is for you if you do that. We've chosen to say things like PrEP is for all genders, PrEP is for you if you feel like it's for you. Another thing that we have learned, really, and I feel like I've learned in my work, is to really support people and communities. The work must be rooted in collaboration, and so it must be interdisciplinary collaboration, or, you know, collaboration that's between people from a variety of sort of disciplines or organizations or capacities, to really create grounded programs, materials that are well informed by science, but must be also rooted in lived experiences. And another example of how we did this, or have continued to do this, is creating sort of tools and materials for, you know, cis women or trans women, when the funding tends not to be for groups other than gay men sometimes, or men who have sex with men. So those are a couple ways that I wanted to share.
That's great. Thank you so much, Yamini. So we have a few more questions, but I don't know if we're going to get to all of our panel questions because we also have a couple questions that have come in. So I'll ask. I'm going to throw one more question out there, and like Tiommi, if you have any responses in terms of sharing a story about how you've used, address the use of language, or even tips on how to, approach people and what's worked or what's not worked in your personal opinion. Since I would love to get your response on that, and then after that we'll switch over to a couple of the audience questions. And then we'll see if we have time for any other panel questions.
Okay, sure. I want to speak to the personal aspect. I have family members whom I disclosed my status to, right, in hopes that they would be like the most understanding. And, it's just not that way. So the language that I've run across has been rooted in ignorance, and it is a willful ignorance, because after I try to explain to a family member that you don't have to risk transmission simply by being around me, because we're not going to engage in any of the activities that, would put you at risk for transmission, and plus I'm undetectable, he still decided that if he were to visit me, he would need to bring his own silverware, cutlery, the plates and all of that, because he didn't want to eat behind me. And again, I tried to explain to him the modes of transmission of HIV. None of that would we be engaging in, and so you wouldn't have to worry. And he still said it. So at that point, when you are just rooted in ignorance and you know that I am educated about this field and you see that I'm everywhere because you follow me on social media, like, I don't know what else to say. This is family. This is family, I have been able to actually change people's hearts and minds from the podium, from a speaker panel, just by them seeing, and understanding that this is my life I'm talking about. I'm not asking for special privileges or anything. I'm a person first. I have always been a person. I will always stand on that. I am a person, regardless of whatever conditions, my socioeconomic standing, my race, my gender. At the end of the day, I'm a person, right? And it just boils down to having common decency and, being willing to actually get outside of yourself. And we don't have enough time to speak about how I've educated, like, providers and all of those things. Let's get to the next question. I wanted to keep it personal for a moment.
Thank you. No, I think that's really important. So I appreciate you kind of talking, because I think probably that resonates with a lot of people. I mean, even in our survey that we did last year, one of the most, when we are asking people about, different scenarios where they have experienced stigma, both in their personal lives and within healthcare settings, I think family members was, among the highest percentage. And so I think that's a really important part to address. So we have a question. There's a quick question I want to just ask that came in earlier that someone asked from San Francisco. Is it acceptable to say seroconvert? I don't know, Vickie, do you want to, or I don't know, anyone that wants to jump in on that one?
No, I don't know much about that.
Yeah.
I can't answer to that either.
Okay, Vickie's on.
I've never heard anyone speak negatively of seroconvert. I mean, it might be something that one day we decide not to use anymore. That's interesting, though. That's something new. I've never heard. Is there a reason the person's asking? Is there something that they find uncomfortable with that word? Because, I'd really be interested to know their perspective on how they see the word.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, if the person's still on and wants to clarify. But feel free to add any additional comments to that. and anyone from our audience can also chime in on their feelings. But yeah, I don't think I've ever seen any kind of negative reaction to that as well. The next question is, sex worker rights are always allying with those who make change. How can allies reach out to us to change language, stigma, and bad laws and policies? I know that PWN definitely has been, such a great body in terms of helping change policy and kind of at a national level. And I don't know if any of the PWN folks on the line have anything to kind of say to that. I mean, I think, I know for the Well Project, we should definitely probably have more resources, and this is something that we've talked about. It just we've also been trying to get this language fact sheet together and kind of webinar for a matter of 2+ years. So it's it's on our radar and we're working on it. Our resources are a little bit slow to catch up with what we want to do. So I recognize that for us, but I don't know if anyone has anything to add of how we can do better.
No, for me, I'd say that it's a great question, and I'm just making a note. I need to do better because I could include some preferred language and empowering language in the work that I do. It just never interesting. Great question.
Yeah, and I think it is a good question. It's something that we should all be thinking about, yeah, and Chris, I'd be happy for you to reach out to me. I think we tried at one point and then it dropped off, but I would definitely love to try and pick that up again to see what we can do from the Well Project standpoint. Yeah. Better support. So, okay, well, we are at 1:26, and I know that we are some of our presenters. We're going to be wrapping up soon. I'm going to post, and I'm going to ask one more question, just in terms of anyone else. Does anyone have even Olivia, I know you've done a lot maybe with the media and I've encountered a couple times trying to address the stigma issue, especially kind of with speakers at conferences, not maybe during the actual conference, but post-conference or post-presentation, and get a little bit of mixed reaction because people kind of maybe at the research or provider level sometimes don't really like hearing from the community about the words that they're using. So I'm wondering if anyone else has kind of an experience of how they've, had to approach that, and whether it's had a positive or sometimes even another reaction.
I feel like I do. This is Caroline. And I find that it's helpful to really model preferred language, and that if people continue to use stigmatizing language, to mention that language is a very important part of fighting stigma, and just be aware that many providers are not educated on preferred language, even though they are highly educated people, but they're not educated on this specific topic, and they'll pick it up or and do their best to pick it up if they're introduced to it in a blame-free way. Many of the people at the CDC stakeholders meetings picked it up after we introduced it, and some people did not, but many people did, and then they talked to us afterwards and said that they were happy to learn about it and happy to incorporate it in the way that they talk about and to patients.
I see a little resistance in the medical science arena around it. Even I'm in a clinic, and I'm communications starting to look at everything we put out, but they said, okay, that's good for communications, but not for the clinic. And I'm not stopping with communications, but I get a little pushback on the medical side. But I like the word blame-free approach, so we will go there.
Thank you. I think that's really important. Yeah. And I'll go ahead.
Sorry, I just was going to add, one of the ways that I feel like we have really, we must combat stigma is to keep an open door as providers or as folks working in the field, as or as allies, as Olivia was mentioning earlier, you know, there's times when we may use words that we're trying to grow from, and there's times when we will get checked by people, and just how can we be accepting of that, and how can we be okay with making that mistake and open to that change, and or incorporate that, what we learn daily, into where we go next.
Great, thank you. And you know, just as an aside, we mentioned earlier in the session, the webinar, that we are planning to, you know, try and do this and with a target to healthcare providers. And we do recognize that we don't want to come across as like, oh, you should be doing this. It's really more just kind of raising awareness and hoping that that kind of elevates kind of the overall attention to just the words that people use. But we're going to be doing it from like kind of just talking a little bit about the impact of stigma on people's lives, and why it's important to, you know, realize how language can, you know, have a relationship to the stigma. And so we're working and we have some great speakers and kind of lined up already. We're still finalizing some others, but and Rancourt from NIH and Vickie Lynn and Valerie are all planning to be part of that. We will give you more information once that is settled, you know, confirmed, so that you can pass that on to your networks, and hopefully we can get a bunch of, you know, providers on that. So, all right, I think we are at 1:30. Just so everyone knows, we are going to be sending out the link to the recording, which includes the slides, after this webinar, and then we can do that pretty immediately after we get the recording downloads, and then we'll also be sending out, once it's set up, a link to the web page that will include, you know, all the information about this webinar, links to the pre and post test, additional resources, and the fact sheet, and everything else that you may want in addition to the recording. So I just want to thank everyone for being part of this, Vickie Lynn and Olivia for your awesome presentations, Tiommi, Venita, Yamini, and Caroline for being part of this panel and all the work that you do, and, you know, both, you know, personally and organizationally, and the awareness that you're bringing to this. And I also want to mention Jenna Conley, who works in the background and really making sure these webinars come together on time and and as organized as they do. So thank you, everyone, and please, you know, spread the word. Language matters.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone. Closing down.